Iowa State Senator Herman Kornbach is a Harvard and Princeton-educated economics professor at Iowa State University. In response to Republican funding proposals for education this week, the Democrat from Ames put out charts claiming funding for public schools has fallen well behind inflation ever since Governor Kim Reynolds took office. One claiming Iowa's per-pupil funding has fallen $1,000 behind inflation ever since Governor Reynolds took office. Here is that chart. The blue line here is the state's actual spending per pupil, which is how most state funding for schools is calculated. The red line, that's what Senator Kornbach calculated Iowa's funding would be if funding had simply kept up with inflation. The gap is over $1,000, $1,048 per student. As a senator, he got some help from the nonpartisan Legislative Services Agency to calculate that exact spending per pupil. Now, we don't have access to that, so we simplified it a bit. We use the state cost per pupil that the LSA publishes each year. Here's those numbers. In fiscal year 2017, when Governor Reynolds became governor, Iowa's cost per pupil was $6,591 per student. Now, using the inflation calculator from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, that would equal $8,876 today when adjusting for inflation. However, this year the state is only spending $7,988 per pupil. That's $888 less per student. If we use the all-encompassing funding number Senator Kornbach has access to, the difference would be more than $1,000 per student in state funding less. Bottom line, Iowa's per-pupil funding for schools is lagging well behind inflation in the last decade. But he adds that equals more than $500 million total statewide that schools would get if state funding simply kept up with inflation under Governor Kim Reynolds. Here's the chart he put out showing his work. The blue line, that's the actual general fund spending on public schools, $3.9 billion this fiscal year. The red is what Senator Kornbach says it should be if it had kept up with inflation since fiscal year 2017. That number, $4.5 billion. This is all based on his calculation that if the state's per-pupil funding, which makes up the majority of state funding for public schools, had kept up with inflation. Now, as a senator, he has access to the nonpartisan Legislative Services Agency, and they calculated what that inflation-adjusted per-pupil spending would mean for total state funding. Now, we don't have access to LSA support, so we took a more straightforward approach. In fiscal year 2017, state funding for Iowa schools totaled just over $3 billion. We plugged that into the federal government's inflation calculator to find out that today that would equal $4.1 billion. But the state's actual funding this year is less than $3.9 billion, a difference of around $270 million less in state funding for public schools. Now, both of these are hypothetical numbers, and Senator Kornbach's access to legislative services gives him a unique ability to calculate the difference. But the bottom line, state education funding is not keeping up with inflation, and it means hundreds of millions of dollars less for Iowa's public schools. Now, we've put all of this data and a link to the inflation calculator in the KCRG News apps so you can check the inflation for yourself. With this I-9 Fact Check, Adam Karras, KCRG TV 9 News.